Hello and welcome, Exiles, to my Energy Blade Inquisitor cast and crit build. Now, I am going to be honest with you. I'm pretty under the weather. I've had a fever the past basically 2 days or something. I don't know. I don't feel great, so I apologize in advance for if I forget to cover some things or I don't do the greatest job here, but I'm going to do my best. So, this build, I have trees for leveling all the way through to basically what we can expect when we're swapping to do Energy Blade in terms of like a self-cast setup, and then the earliest possible way you could get cast on crit online. I'll go over that. And then we have some setups for an Ivory Tower where we can't afford split personalities yet, but this setup's still pretty good. Balbala, Ivory Tower, Wrathpith. This setup will still get you to do Ubers on a 5-link. And then last but not least, we have a tree, a generic recommendation for how to do a split personality tree. And this, of course, is much higher scaling than the non-split personality tree. You can't get away with this until you get decent split personalities, but for the time being, this is something you can work towards and farm up to get the split personalities, because the version with just Ivory Tower, Wrathpith, and whatnot is pretty good. Now, to start things off with, before we get into going over the different variations, I took a lot of time well, first off, hold on, sorry, pause right there. If you have the POB, make sure if you want to look at the different gear sets, I have a drop down for different gear sets. I have a drop down for the different skill sets, and I have a drop down for the different trees. So for example, if you are on the tree for the level 68 self-cast person, and then you pull up the tree for Ivory Tower, it's going to cause some issues because it's going to think you're reserving all your life because of the fact that the Ivory Tower setup reserves a lot more life, and it requires you to have the different tree for it to make sense. So just know, if you get some weird numbers and you're like, this doesn't look right, it's probably one of those things you maybe swap the skill set. And then on top of that, if you do go for the Ivory Tower setups, you have the skills set up for Ivory Tower, and then you have the tree set up for the Ivory Tower, and you're still thinking, okay, this is looking, actually, it remembered I have these checked. Okay, well, point is, if for whatever reason these flasks get unchecked, just know these are permanent uptime flasks, the Core Scan Elixir and the Bismuth. The way it works is you have it on reuse at the end of the flask, and we generate enough flash charges with Balbala that they'll basically never run out, unless you go AFK for a very long time. If you're doing any sort of content, you're fighting monsters, you're fighting bosses, whatever it is, you're going to generate just a little bit of extra charges, which is going to keep you topped off, and you're never going to run out if you're actually playing the game. If you go AFK, this will eventually run out, but as far as playing the game, it's never going to be a concern. All right, anyways, now let's get into the notes section. I want to start off with just the pros and the cons, and should you play this build. I want to be upfront about what this build is for and what you can expect in terms of what's bad with it, what's good with it. So to start off with, the pros are it's very high damage early. I have this character just fully gassed for damage to do Sanctum early with just enough defense to not really get one tapped in Sanctum. That's my idea. My whole goal for this League Start is to rush Sanctum. I think it can be a very good currency making strategy. I know the tome drop rates got nerfed. I really don't think it's going to affect our ability to make a handsome profit, especially early game. Very few builds are strong enough or have enough damage to do Sanctum early, so most likely everybody who gets a Sanctum in their early maps, they're just going to be selling them, and we're going to be buying them and running them. I'm not planning to do mapping. I'm planning to farm Sanctum and use that currency to buy my upgrades. Also, it scales fantastically with upgrades. You make sizable gains each time you get upgrades. This is one of those builds where I would put it in contrast with something like RF, where you could squeeze another +1 level onto your Scepter, but it's going to cost you a fortune to do it, and the damage upgrade is only going to feel meh. It's going to only feel okay. It's going to cost you a lot, and you're not going to get a lot out of it. This build, on the other hand, every upgrade you get feels very sizable. You can see your ES pool jump 10, 15, 20%. You can see the changes. You can see the damage go way up. A lot of these upgrades are very sizable, and it scales. Basically, it's one of those builds where the scaling is kind of like exponential, where the more of you get, the more you get out of it, and it feels very good to put upgrades into, or at least investment into, at least I think so. Also, this can be used with virtually any spell. The scaling is very generic. You can do cast on crit with any spell you want, which I think is great, because you can try out the new Transfigured Gems, and you can find a skill you like, and you can swap things around, get a lot of experience with a lot of new gems, and it's not very specific. You can do whatever you want, and that should be, hopefully, a pretty fun time. I personally have some skills that I've already looked at that I think are worth checking out. I think they could be pretty strong, and I'm going to keep trying to add to this list over here as we get more information on that. And then lastly, it has the spin to win playstyle. It's very few buttons to press. You just basically shield charge, frost blink around, and then cyclone on enemies. That's pretty much it. I activate Blood Rage at the start of a map and it just stays up all the way to a boss. There's not really much you have to think about. It's pretty low brain maintenance. Anyways, outside of that though, the cons are very squishy early game. Because I am speccing this character for Sanctum, I am foregoing a lot of the normal defense I would try to fit in early because I just need the damage so badly early that early on the defenses is squishy. Ghost Wraith, it does get you a good amount of energy shield early, but it also makes you highly susceptible to stuns because it cuts your life pool in half, and then you're putting on Energy Blade, which cuts your ES in half. So early game, you're very on like a fragile state of being. It's great for Sanctum because you do damage and you have enough HP where you're going to survive in Sanctum, but if you tell yourself, I'm going to go do maps right away, you're going to die a lot. You're going to die a decent amount. I say 65 to 80 is when it's going to feel kind of rough on survivability. Realistically, once you get ES Leech, you get Calm, Stun Immune, stuff like that, it starts to feel decent or okay. And then once you get an Ivory Tower setup, it just kind of takes off because you start getting so much ES that the bad defenses you had early really start to become non-existent with the amount of EHP you're scaling. On top of that, you can actually scale armor decently with Ivory Tower, Crown of the Inward Eye. Those are actually items that have some decent armor on there. Throw in Determination. Our tree actually gets a decent amount of percent armor. If you look at the Ivory Tower setup here, we have armor in the early nodes here. We have armor here. And we could even get armor here if we wanted to fit it in. Honestly, this is a level 93 character. These might be the next points I'd go for. And then that plus high ES plus recover ES when you take any fizz damage, or that plus the 10% armor applies to cast damage, starts to be pretty solid. But early game, you are very squishy. So my TLDR for this is basically, if you don't want to run Sanctum at all, if you want to go straight into maps, I'd caution you against it. It's going to be definitely very squishy, and I want to be upfront about that because I am designing this to do Sanctum. If you are planning to play this build regardless, I would say look at this level 68 tree here and maybe invest less in damage and invest more into some defenses. Like, for example, instead of going for the crit wheel this early, maybe you go and you get instant leech or something. You want ES leech so you actually sustain your energy shield pool, and then force a lot of your EHP nodes like melding and life nodes, ES nodes where you can fit them in, stuff like that. You want to start prioritizing that earlier before you start forcing in damage. That would be my recommendation to you. So anyways, that's the should you play this build. Basically, keep in mind, very squishy early, and it's set up for Sanctum. It scales great, and it gets a lot tankier, but the early game is very squishy, and I want to be upfront about that. Now, outside of all that, the rest of this POB, I have a section on leveling where you can watch the VOD where I leveled this character. My leveling strategy, if you look at this tree, you'll notice at level 46, we have Elemental Overload, we have the dual wield set up here, we have the Fire Mastery with 100% damage against ignited enemies. My whole plan here is essentially have a tree where I need about 14 respecs, which you will get in the campaign. You don't need extra regret orbs on top of that. Basically, the idea is get OP leveling where you don't need Energy Blade, you don't need Ghost Wraith early, and this will carry you all the way to Act 10 Kataba. If you watch the VOD, this is what I leveled as. I played with Firestorm plus Cremation, but honestly, a lot of the new Transfigured Gems, if you swap to one of those, like, those might be decent. I might try out some other skills while doing it, but I did Firestorm and Cremation. Honestly, Firestorm probably would have been enough by itself, and then would have saved me a lot of headache of trying to figure out my gems with Cremation, because Firestorm was doing most of the damage anyways, or at least it felt like that to me. But the idea here is, I don't necessarily need to be able to afford Ghost Wraith until I get all the way through the campaign, at which point you'll see here, I'm still playing as, I don't know how this node got clicked, I definitely misclicked that just now. Basically, I level as this self-cast EO setup, and then the second I swap to getting my Merc Lab done, basically I finish my Merc Lab, then I go and say, okay, I dropped a few Chaos, I did a little bit of Chaos recipe, I went and did a couple lock-picking heists, you get a few Chaos on your name, and then you go ahead and you get yourself a Ghost Wraith, super common, super cheap, Crown of Thorns, super common, super cheap, Khaleesi's, common, super cheap, and Lori's Lantern. You get one of each of those uniques. Those are your starter items, and then from there you can start doing the self-cast setup with Firestorm and Energy Blade, and that should put you at enough damage to do quite well, or at least I think it will. And that's the idea there. You don't have to do 2 Lori's Lanterns, by the way. This is just I was being lazy. Generally, a second item that's a rare ring will be a bit better than a second Lori's. Lori's is good as one item just because it gives you the damage is unlucky against you, which is a nice little extra defensive layer. But a second Lori's, I think, is a bit weaker than just getting a decent rare with life and res and whatnot, because usually you can get more stats than just 20 all res and 25 chaos res. So keep that in mind. Alrighty. So that goes over the leveling. I go over some gems and stuff like that. You can look at it yourself. For the gearing, I have a better trading import folder. If you just Control C and you copy this whole link here, and you were to go over to the trade site, simply put, you could, if you get the better trading, it's a Chrome extension. You could go over here. You could say new folder, or new folder. Sorry, you could do import folder. You do the import code, and it says Inquisitor Spellblade buy list 21 bookmarks, and that is this right here, where you have all the early items and some of the uniques to switch to the mid game and late game stuff all set up for you, where you can just click on these and get some easy quick searches for Ghostwraith or whatever item it is you need to purchase. That just hopefully should save you some time and make the purchasing of your gear slots a little bit easier. On top of that, I go over the early gear prioritization along with mid game and end game, talking about some of the crafts and how you do them and what I recommend. And then later on, I go over cast on crit cooldown recovery breakpoints. One of the really cool things about this character is the first attack speed breakpoint, 6.06. We hit that we hit that perfectly. Just with our tree, with if you go to our tree here, you go the earliest cast on crit setup. Weirdly enough, just with the 5% attack speed here, 10% attack speed from this in precision, and then the 4% from this small node here, just that 19% attack speed, you combine that with Cyclone, and you combine that with Energy Blade, and you actually hit exactly 6.06 times in game. It's very funny to me, but it's like, it just perfectly gets you that first breakpoint, which honestly, the first breakpoint can take you all the way to Ubers. My Scuff setup that was on a 5 link had no CDR. It was just the first breakpoint, but I'll show you this real quick here. In game, you'll see I pop the Energy Blade, you go to Cyclone right here, 6.06, that's how much attacks we have per second, and that's just using Energy Blade and then having the 10% from these two nodes, 5% here, and the 4% from the small node here. So that's how you get your cast on crit breakpoint really early on, and it feels pretty good. All right, on top of that, I go over basically explaining ideal stuff for getting to the 14%, 52% CDR breakpoint. We can hit 52% CDR breakpoint with my Giga Chad setup. It is a little bit scuffed, but it hits 52% CDR. I'm a little bit under the attack speed breakpoint. But ideally, when you're doing cast on crit, you want to always be either just a little bit lower on the attack speed, or exactly on the dot of the exact attack speed breakpoint. Keep in mind, if you are faster than if you hit faster than the CDR breakpoint, you will miss procs. Essentially what happens is you attack, you proc your cast on crit, and then your CDR is going to happen in 1 second, but your next attack is going to happen in 0.99. And what ends up happening is you hit before the CDR is up, and that means you have to hit again before the cast on crit will proc. So you end up wasting like a whole, whatever it is, 1 second, half a second. Obviously, when you're talking CDR, it's something that's happening, 5 times a second, 10 times a second. But the idea is you always want to be either a little bit slower than your attack speed breakpoint or exactly on the dime or exactly on the dot. And with early game, just Energy Blade and the tree I recommend, you will have exactly that first breakpoint. And then late game, when you invest and start getting action speed in your build, start getting onslaught, frenzy charges, all that sort of stuff, that's when you need to start thinking about it a little bit more and mapping it out for yourself. Of course, I'm planning to min-max this build at least to the point of split personalities, and hopefully we'll get to this 10.1 breakpoint so I can give you a basically idea of what to shoot for and how to do it, but that's the idea there. Other things I go over is what do you need to swap to cast on crit? Now, the earliest possible swap is what I have right here. Essentially, you need an Essence of Horror pair of gloves. Essence of Horror is basically just a way to get an early 5 link for cast on crit. It takes the place of doing an increased crit strike support. I believe a Essence of Horror is generally going to be much cheaper than a 5-link Ghost Wraith or a 5-link Ivory Tower, and it can get you started earlier. Yes, you want to eventually swap into Shaper's Touch, but Shaper's Touch isn't available early, and Shaper's Touch also is pretty mediocre when you only have 300 and 300 strength. It's not that great of an item. So ideally, you want to get higher stats, and that's when Shaper's Touch really starts to take off. But you'll see here we have basically a T2 Fractured Accuracy. Essentially what you need is you need maybe one item with some okay accuracy. We have Precision on Arrogance, and then we have a little bit of accuracy from Precision here, and a little bit of accuracy from Anointing Depth Perception. Essentially what I did to swap the cast on crit is I had Khaleesi's Grace, I had a self-cast set up right here, and I didn't have High Voltage, and I didn't have Depth Perception. I didn't have either of those checked. I had Coordination, and I had, like, I don't know, I was going towards melding or something, I can't remember. But basically, you need to go into this high voltage for the 100% crit chance, and you need to get your accuracy fixed a little bit, and then you can swap to it. I don't really recommend swapping into it this early. I'd recommend waiting until you have quality on your Cyclone, because Cyclone you just feel so sluggish and slow with. It's going to just feel meh, I think. I think you really want to wait until you get a quality Cyclone, and maybe quality on your Energy Blade, because Cyclone or cast on crit early puts you in some dangerous situations, and your early game defenses are on the weaker side. But if you want to swap to it just as early as possible, this is how you can do it. I still would recommend chilling with Khaleesi's Grace, doing self-cast until a bit higher levels. Also, the other thing we have is we did have Spiritual Command. This was to help us leap slam around fast. It was a quality of life, let's go fast thing, but you have to drop it when you're swapping to cast on crit, because it gives you way too much attack speed, and your cast on crit breakpoint is just bricked, essentially. So that's what you have to keep in mind. If you had these nodes spec, you have to unspec those, and you have to hit exactly the attack speed nodes we have here. All you need to know is when you have Cyclone, you have the 6.06, that's when you know you have it correct. And roughly our character's crit chance right now is, I guess, 63 with these gloves on, or with the Cyclone. And then our Firestorm is around 70. And then that's before Assassin's Mark. Assassin's Mark would probably pick this up to closer to 70, 80 crit chance. And then offense on Cyclone, we have about 2k accuracy, which in white maps is quite good. But obviously, as you scale the build into the late game, you want to get more accuracy, which Shaper's Touch will solve by itself. As you min-max the character, Shaper's Touch will kind of carry your accuracy because you'll get so much just from the int. But anyways, that's how the character works, and that's how the early swap is done. Now, let's talk about mana real quick. Generally, with cast on crit, mana is a big issue. You need to solve the cost of your Cyclone, and you need to solve the cost of the spell you're triggering 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times a second. That's a lot of cost. How do you solve it? Well, to start off with, number one is you keep Cyclone at level 1. With the changes to Cyclone, max stages no longer affect your AoE, so that means a level 1 Cyclone is going to have just as much AoE as a level 20 Cyclone as far as I can tell, which means you just get the lower cost with no downside, and that's perfect. Keep Cyclone level 1, fantastic. Number 2 is you can use your main skill as a level 1 gem. If you notice here, I'll showcase, oops, I shouldn't have, I accidentally got, that was a bit of a misplay there. Essentially, you have a level 1 gem versus a level 20 gem. There is a large disparity in mana cost. I'll showcase this real quick here on my, I have the split personality character. I can't showcase you guys the 5-link no split personality tree. That's a lot more budget because that was a Shifting Stones character, which went void. But hopefully this can still give you the picture of what we're talking about. So what you can do is, say you have Shock Nova. You have a level 1 Shock Nova versus a level 21 Shock Nova. Level 21 has the base cost of 24 mana, whereas level 1 has the base cost of 12. So when you're considering putting this on your character, you'll notice a level 21 mana cost is going to be much higher. It's 24 mana after all the multipliers are considered, versus a level 1 Shock Nova is 8 mana per second. That is a difference in 3x the mana cost. Now, our character gets a lot of mana from strength and int, and we have a decent amount of regen from that. And if you fit in clarity, you can have some okay regen. Like right now, we have 118 mana regen. With 8 mana a set, or 8 mana cost, and if we triggered 10 times a second, we can definitely afford this. On top of the fact our Cyclone is a 2 mana cost skill, which if we're hitting 10 times a second, we're not right now, obviously. I need frenzy charges and blood rage on and stuff like that. But if we're hitting 10 times a second, this would cost us about 20 mana a second. So we would definitely afford it. The difference is the damage changes by about 10%. You look at the tooltip, it says average 970, 980k versus the level 1 says an average of 900k. That's about the difference in about 10% damage. Essentially, you get so much flat from the energy blade that your spell base damage just doesn't really matter so much. And on top of that, right now I'm doing inspiration because originally I was thinking of doing a level 21 gem. I didn't think about this too much. Honestly, if I just swapped inspiration out for a different damage multiplier, it might end up making more sense. I will also say, if you look at this character, I just yoinked some gear I had made on a previous build I did. This isn't really the correct gear. The gear we should have right now should be Fractured Int, Fractured Strength, Essence of Scorn until we get T1 of the either Int or Strength. So we have T1 Int, T1 Strength, Crit Multi, then do a Veiled Chaos to get like Unveiled Life plus mana regen, and then bench crafting on minus flat mana cost. Right now on our tree, we have a Clarity minus cost jewel. This just isn't really ideal. If we had the correct jewelry, that's what we would go for, and it would work a lot better. But I just want to preface that so you have a heads up on what to go for. Ultimately, I say all this to essentially say you can keep gems at level 1 if you're having mana issues. You'll still have basically very similar damage, but on top of that, you will solve your mana problem by that as well. But the thing is, if you get reduced cost on your flask, you get minus cost on your rings, you should be able to go to a level 21 if you want to. I know I did end up doing a Inspiration Divergent. Ultimately, if you do a regular Inspiration 2120 with the new quality, instead of 44% reduced cost, it'll be, I believe, 40 reduced cost. So it'll be very similar to this. I just didn't really want to de-level the gem. I think it wouldn't really change the result of how this ends up working. Anyways, hopefully I explained that well. For solving mana, essentially you can change the gem levels, and that does a lot of it. And then on top of that, going for finite minus flat mana cost on your rings, going for reduced mana cost craft on your flasks, stuff like that can all help as well. In early game, the base damage of the gem is a lot more important because you haven't scaled your ES super high and you aren't getting just an omega amount of spellblade damage. At this point, if you do a level 1 gem versus the level 20 gem or whatever, it's closer to like a 20% DPS loss, at which point maybe it's worth considering running Clarity plus Enduring just to force it in still in the early game with those higher gem levels. This is something I want to clarify, which is what I am doing. Eventually, when I swap to Cast on Crit, I'll probably just de-level to level 1, maybe do that to solve my mana problems a little bit more cleanly. All right, that goes over mana. Now let's talk about Wildwood Ascendancy. If you notice, on my character I have set up for the build, that's level 69, you'll notice I don't have a single gem in my chest piece or in my boots. I specifically wanted to see what was the bare minimum I thought could work gem-wise to make the Wildwood Oath of Magi node work early, which gives us 30% movement speed, and it doubles the flat ES from our Ghost Wraith. So we'd actually have another 260 flat ES, and we'd have 30 movement speed. And I was planning essentially early game, because stun is a problem with Ghost Wraith, I was going to actually recommend Calm's Roots here, which give you stun immunity and allow you to not be slowed on your base action speed, which I believe means you don't need to get freeze and chill immunity, which essentially can push you towards maybe being able to drop Purity of Elements and go for like a damage aura or something a little bit more like fun, like haste for speed. If you're still doing self-cast, haste would feel really good, just leap slam faster around the sanctum and cast faster. I think that would be decent. So that is the idea here. Oath of Magi, the first 2 points, I believe we've been told we get them around Act 2 or 3. I would recommend bum rushing those nodes, get Oath of Magi early, and then maybe don't worry about the mechanic, or you can try to add in some tincture skins, maybe bark skin, or even the node that gives you the ability to make it so monsters don't suppress or block, which is quite good considering there can be some monsters that have like 100% Giga Suppress or map mods or stuff like that. Block can be annoying. This little mark thing can be feels good, I believe. So early game, Oath of Magi, the first 2 points, I think is solid because you get movement speed plus you get the flat ES, and I think it works okay. Granted, late game, we want to start using more gem sockets. We want to put enhance on our energy blade, stuff like that. But early game, this works out pretty well. Speaking of quality on energy blade, this is one thing I didn't cover yet, but I do have it written right here. Energy blade took one of the biggest buff out of all the skill gems, and that's the quality. Energy blade went from giving you 10% base crit to your energy blade, which is why this thing can go to 7.7 if you have 20 quality, or can go to like 8.4 if you have enhance on it. That crit chance is not necessary. This build gets so much crit chance that amount of crit chance is irrelevant. It doesn't really matter. But what the quality was changed to is it cancels out the less ES mod from Energy Blade. If you look at the skill, you'll see this. It says buff grants 50% less energy shield. The 5% more ES that occurs when you put quality on this takes this to 45% less. It cancels out the less modifier. It's actually a lot more powerful than the 5% it sounds like. It's actually double that. It feels like 10% more if you get 20 quality on this, where it gives you 10% more ES after you've turned on Energy Blade, which is 10% more damage, 10% more defense, and then if you put on enhance, that's giving you 20% more damage, 20% more defense. It feels very good. One of the strongest, I think, W's for a build when it comes to the alternate qualities. Not only that, Cyclone no longer needs you to scale stages. You can keep it at level 1. It has better base AoE, and it got the alt quality of Divergent, but a juiced version where the quality on Cyclone gives you 10% more movement speed instead of 5%, which ends up feeling quite good to make Cyclone going fast feel really good. Just because of the quality on Cyclone, on the mid-game setup, I do have a Stampede on that build, but I think with the new Cyclone quality, honestly, Stampede's probably not the play, but I still am going to keep it here because that's what I had when I did the Shifting Stones League, because that new quality makes Cyclone a lot faster, and you start adding in more movement speed modifiers, action speed, stuff like that, it'll feel pretty solid. Okay, I think that goes over the POB pretty well. Essentially, match whatever tree you're doing with the different gear set, get an idea of how the build works and what to shoot for. The leveling setup is all about prioritizing the early game damage of the basically meta of speedrunners, which is the dual wield attack at cast speed, leap slam attack. Essentially, you have to do like a main hand weapon and a main hand sword, and you get to leap slam around fast. You want to get weapons with decent attack speed, and it feels very good for speed. That being said, on top of that, there's another OP thing for leveling, which is Battle Mage. Battle Mage with a good flat damage weapon is insanely OP for leveling. If you just ID your rares, whatever you get, a decent axe, a decent sword, a decent flat damage mace if it has okay attack speed, if you chuck that on your main hand and your offhand is the weapon that doesn't have as much flat on it, as long as you have two different weapons, that base damage from Battle Mage should carry you easily all the way to Katava, and that's what we're doing for leveling. So that's the idea there, and of course, you can watch the Twitch VOD for how I leveled right here if you want an example. All right, I think that covers the POB. I think it gives you a good idea of what this character looks like. Essentially, we've made this character to bum rush Sanctum, because I think it'll be very good early on to profit and make a good amount of currency and upgrade our character, and I think this character scales insanely and is a lot of fun to play. So that's my takeaway. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you guys enjoy the build. And until next time, I'm going to try to get Bait or No Bait done before. Last league, I couldn't get it done because I had too much IRL stuff going on. We'll see if this league goes a little bit better. I am sick. Hopefully I start feeling better soon because I got a lot of stuff IRL I still need to do on top of wanting to do Bait or No Bait. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. As always, thanks for watching, Exiles. Take care and peace out.